In a land scorched and laid waste, faint temple bells can be heard in the distance. Aristocrats copy poetry by candlelight, while provincial armies march across the countryside. In Kyoto, elegant court ceremonies take place beneath a veneer of screens even as fires, famine, and political intrigue threaten the fragile capital. The world of the late medieval, early warring states Japan was one of instability, transformation, and the profound artistic refinement. Between the collapse of the aristocratic and shogunal authority and the rise of the regional military powers, cultural life evolved through political fragmentation. From the late Heian period through the Muromachi era, Japan experienced dramatic shifts in power. New Buddhist sects arose, and as the societal landscapes changed, so did the aesthetics. The old social elite lost their prominence while warriors rose up and claimed those empty spots. Buddhist institutions expanded their political, economic, and religious influence, and artistic traditions became increasingly intertwined with religious, economic, and political centers of power. Yet, amid all of this warfare and political upheaval, medieval Japan also witnessed extraordinary cultural flourishing. Court music, Buddhist chant, poetry, knoll theater, ink painting, and instrumental traditions continued to evolve in both aristocratic and religious circles. The boundaries between social classes became increasingly fluid, allowing for court nobles to bring courtly knowledge and traditions to provincial warriors, and temples to engage with and patronize regional artistic movements. Historians describe this period as an age of contradiction, one of both refinement and violence, spiritual depth and social unrest. For an exploration of this unique period, see The World Turned Upside Down, Medieval Japanese Society by Pierre-François Soury. Music particularly played a multifaceted role within this world. Far beyond, it served as entertainment for some. Sound functioned as ritual practice, making time in rituals and service for others. Spiritual disciplines and political symbols were invoked and amassed for political and cultural capital. For others, music became an artistic cultivation and an escape from the chaos. Musical lineage guarded their teachings carefully, transmitting repertoires and techniques through hereditary systems that stretched back centuries. The preservation of these traditions became increasingly important as Japan moved deeper into an age of uncertainty and transition. It was within this environment that the figure for today's Unmasked series, Toyohara no Muneaki, emerged. Standing as inheritor of an old tradition at this transitional point between the medieval and early modern worlds, Muneaki's Japan was still deeply shaped by court ritual and Buddhist cosmology, yet already moving toward the fractured and dynamic society, including events and the history that would eventually give rise to the later artistic traditions. Cultural background. Before we can begin the biographical information about Toyohara no Muneaki, we must give a background of the culture just before and during his lifetime to understand his work. 1450 to 1524, the life of Toyohara no Muneaki. Toyohara no Muneaki lived during one of the most unstable and transformative periods in Japanese history. Born during the late Muromachi period, 1450, and living into the early 16th century, Muneaki witnessed the collapse of the centralized authority, the eruption of civil war, the rise of regional warlords, and profound changes in religion, trade, and culture. Japan, during his lifetime, was in a state of constant flux. Circa 1450, Japan under the Ashikaga shogunate. When Muneaki was born, Japan was officially ruled by the Ashikaga shoguns from Kyoto, although the Muromachi government possessed a symbolic legitimacy, real political authority had already begun to deteriorate. Powerful regional military governors, Shugo daimyo, increasingly acted independently of the central governmental power. The effects this had on Japan were not minimal. The imperial court remained culturally influential but had no political power. Aristocratic arts such as gagaku, poetry waka, painting, literature, alongside arts outside of the court such as Noh theater and linked verse renga, continued to flourish despite political instability. The warrior elites became major patrons of religion and the arts, and Kyoto remained the cultural center of Japan. These changes, along with increased opportunities for patronage, allowed hereditary artistic families such as the Toyohara lineage to preserve court traditions despite growing financial instability within the imperial court. During this period, the court struggled to maintain its ceremonial rites, often lacking the resources to perform them fully. Emperor Go-Shiwabara, whom Muneaki served, was even forced to delay his own succession right for nearly 2 decades after his father's death in 1500 due to a lack of funds. The Onin War. Few events in Japanese history shattered the medieval order as completely as the Onin War. Beginning in 1467 and lasting for more than a decade, the conflict devastated Kyoto, destroyed the remaining strength of the Ashikaga shogunate, and permanently altered the political and cultural trajectory of Japan. Historians identify the war as the beginning of the Sengoku, or Warring States period, an age defined by fractured authority, endemic warfare, and social upheaval. At first glance, the war began as a succession dispute within the Ashikaga government. Petty but regal, Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa had failed to produce an heir and initially intended for his brother to succeed him. However, after the unexpected birth of his son, rival factions formed around competing claims to succession. These tensions quickly expanded beyond the shogunal household itself, drawing in powerful military families such as the Hosokawa and Yamana clans, each commanding vast regional alliances. What may have begun as political maneuvering soon spiraled into total civil war. Kyoto became the battlefield. Entire districts were burned to the ground. Aristocratic residencies, temples, libraries, and administrative centers were destroyed in repeated waves of fighting. Contemporary accounts describe smoke constantly hanging over the capital, while refugees fled throughout ruined streets once associated with the elegance of courtly life. For many Japanese contemporaries, it appeared as though the world itself was in fact turning upside down. The destruction of Kyoto carried enormous consequences far beyond the city. The Ashikaga shogunate, already weakened before the conflict, never recovered meaningful authority afterwards. Although the shogunate, as an institution, survived, its practical power dissolved. Provincial military governors and regional warrior families increasingly acted independently, ruling their territories without significant oversight from Kyoto. Political authority fragmented across the country, giving rise to the autonomous warlords, later known as daimyo. The social consequences were equally profound. The rigid hierarchies that had governed medieval Japanese society began to weaken under the pressures of constant warfare and instability. Lower-ranking warriors overthrew superiors. Peasant uprising became more common, and ambitious regional leaders rose through military strengths rather than inherited prestige alone. This atmosphere of upheaval contributed to the phenomenon later described as Gekkokujo, the low overthrow the high. Yet, paradoxically, the collapse of centralized order also accelerated cultural transformation. As aristocrats, monks, artists, and musicians fled the violence of Kyoto, many carried elite traditions into provincial regions that had previously remained distant from court culture. Practices once concentrated within the capital began spreading throughout Japan. For hereditary musicians and artistic lineages, the war represented both catastrophe and urgency. Old traditions that had survived for centuries suddenly appeared fragile. The instability of the age intensified efforts to preserve musical knowledge, ritual practices, and systems of transmission before they vanished entirely. It was within the shadow of this fractured and uncertain world that figures such as Toyohara no Muneaki lived and worked. Inheritors of traditions struggling to survive amid one of the most turbulent periods in Japanese history. The aftermath of the Onin War. In the decades following the devastation of the Onin War, Japan entered an age of both violence and cultural refinement. During the lifetime of Toyohara no Muneaki, Zen Buddhism remained culturally significant, particularly within the artistic and intellectual circles, though its influence on warrior class has often been overstated. Daimyo of the period were frequently more eager to patronize classical court culture, inviting figures such as Ichijo Kaneyoshi to lecture on the works like The Tale of Genji and the Kokin Wakashu as aristocrats fled the capital. There, they were to engage deeply with Zen doctrine itself. As political authority and wealth shifted away from the court and shogunate, regional daimyo increasingly became the primary patrons of cultural life. In this environment, Zen aesthetics and Han, aka Chinese learning, helped shape ideals of restraint, impermanence, discipline, and cultivated simplicity that came to define much of the late medieval Japanese art. Practices such as ink painting, knoll theater, and tea ceremony flourished under this new patronage system. Tea culture in particular evolved into both an aesthetic discipline and a display of cultural capital, with daimyo using gatherings, utensils, and artistic taste to assert refinement and legitimacy. It was within this context that influential tea masters began to emerge as important cultural authorities in their own right. This atmosphere affected the world of music in a far more immediate and material way. For gagaku musicians, the devastation of the Onin War resulted in the loss of instruments, robes, scores, and performance traditions tied to the court itself. In the aftermath of the conflict, musical practice became deeply concerned with preservation and survival. Court musicians were not primarily focused on ideals of inner cultivation, but on maintaining hereditary repertoires and rebuilding fragile traditions amid political collapse and economic instability. At the same time, Japan was becoming increasingly connected to the broader East Asian trade networks. Maritime commerce with China and Korea expanded significantly during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, bringing new goods, ideas, and artistic influences into Japan. Chinese books, philosophies, ceramics, and luxury objects circulated widely among elite and religious communities. Urban centers grew wealthier through trade, while regional military leaders used commercial wealth to strengthen their political authority. Alongside legitimate commerce, pirate groups known as wako operated throughout East Asian waters, reflecting both the opportunities and instabilities created by expanding maritime exchange. Politically, however, the nation continued to fracture. In 1493, the Meiyō coup dealt another devastating blow to the already weakened Ashikaga government when Hosokawa Masamoto effectively seized control of the shogunate. The authority of the shogun became increasingly ceremonial, while rival daimyo competed violently for regional dominance. As centralized rule collapsed, powerful warlords such as Hojo Soun and Takeda Nobutora consolidated territorial control through military force. Castles and fortified towns spread throughout the countryside. Warfare became a near constant reality across many provinces, and regional identities grew stronger than loyalty to Kyoto itself. Samurai culture gradually transformed from court-centered services to territorial military rule, laying the foundation for the Sengoku age that would dominate Japan for generations. Now, there is still way more that could be discussed historically in this time period, but with this background firmly established, we can now go and move on to the biography of Toyohara no Muneaki. Toyohara no Muneaki, a biography. Muneaki was not just another court musician, but a central cultural figure of his age, a hereditary shoal player of the Toyohara lineage. instructor to Emperor Go Kashiwabara, student of the poet Sanjo Nishi Sanetaka, and associate of the Renga monk Socho. Now, if there were any names to drop, these would be the names. The Toyohara house traces its lineage all the way back to Emperor Tenmu, birth unknown, but lived until 686. He reigned from 673 to 686, but actually took up the Sho sometime in the Heian era. Muneaki's fourth great-grandfather, Tatsuaki, 1291 to 1363, served as the Sho instructor to not only Ashikaga Takauji, the founder of the Ashikaga shogunate, but the reigning emperor Go Kogon. If these names are unfamiliar to you, just know that it's a huge deal. Think of Tatsuaki as serving both as piano teacher to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and at the same time serving as the music teacher to the British royal family. Being in the position of teaching both the reigning shogun and emperor led to the position due to hereditary, and within the position came elevation in court rank. So as expected, Muneaki follows his father and is appointed to the same position and becomes Emperor Go Kashiwabara's teacher of the Sho. So this is our first point of correction that has been misunderstood in many writings about the Taigensho and Muneaki. He was not a random court musician. He served in one of the highest roles that a court musician could possibly have, and in 1518 was advanced by Go Kashiwabara to be the head of the music bureau itself. Sometime around 1495, Muneaki began to study waka poetry under Sanjo Nishi Sanetaka. Being a student of Sanetaka is also nothing to simply pass over. He was the premier poet of his time. To put it bluntly, Sanetaka is often considered the foremost intellectual of his age. He was also a pivotal figure in preserving classical Japanese culture during wartime, amassing a library of texts that became a major repository of knowledge. He was the founder of two schools, the Oye-ryu School of Incense Appreciation and the Shoyo or Sanjo-in School of Calligraphy. Furthermore, he achieved the rank of Naidaijin, Minister of the Center. Under Sanetaka's tutelage, Muneaki produced a number of texts over the 2+ decades of his life, from a solo poetry match of his own poetry, Toyohara no Muneaki Jika Awase, in 1501, to an anthology of his own poetry, Shokasho, the Poetic Treaty Beneath the Pines, in 1521. Also consider his association with Sayokuken Socho, who is considered by most of his time and even today as one of the greatest renga, linked verse, poets of all time. Socho was a disciple of the renga master Sogi, and together with his master and fellow disciple Shohaku, produced the most iconic works of linked verse genre, the three poets of Minase Sangin Hyakuin, and the three poets of Yuyama Sangin Hyakuin. With Sogi's passing in 1502, Socho was beginning to take his place as the main figure and future in the Rengo world, just as Muneaki was in the early stages of his studies of waka poetry. The two interacted within Sanetaka's circle of poetry and became and remained friends until Muneaki's death in 1524. Socho, in his journal, records a poem that Muneaki sends along with some medicine and his own response in the year of Muneaki's death, as well as the poem he, Sanetaka, and other members of the circle composed on the first anniversary of Muneaki's passing in the following year. While there is not much material on the entirety of Muneaki's life, what we do have reveals that Muneaki is not some random court musician seeking some prestige through his writings and music endeavors, but was rather at the apex of the cultural zeitgeist of his day. The Taigensho. The Taigensho, the Toyohara family treaty, is one of the most important surviving treatises on Japanese court music from the late medieval period. Completed in 1512 by Muneaki, the work incorporates material on gagaku performance, practice, court ritual, literary culture, and Buddhist thought. As such, Taigensho reflects not only musical knowledge, but the broader intellectual and aesthetic discussions of the late Muromachi Japan. Written in the aftermath of the Onin War, a conflict that devastated Kyoto and severely disrupted court culture, Taigensho also can be understood as an act of preservation. Muneaki witnessed the destruction of the capital and the decline of court musical traditions firsthand. In a period where he could see Sanjonishi Sanetaka preserving and accumulating text, and Go Kashiwabara trying to restore the imperial court, Muneaki compiled the treaty to gather, maintain, and transmit the knowledge, theories, instruments, and ceremonial functions associated within his house as a way to avoid their loss. Unlike many earlier musical manuals, Taigensho is remarkably interdisciplinary. Alongside discussions of instruments and performance practice, it contains references to waka poetry and other literary text, music theory, historical anecdotes, and Buddhist devotion. Particularly significant are the repeated invocations of the Lotus Sutra, Namu-myoho Renge-kyo, that close each chapter, and discussions of Nichiren Shonin himself and Nichiren Buddhism, suggesting a relationship between court music and Nichiren Buddhism practice that has not been seen nor discussed in scholarship. The work reveals how music in medieval Japan functioned not only as isolated art forms, but was part of a larger network involving literary, religious, and aristocratic culture. Of special importance is the Shakuhachi passage, contained in the 5th chapter of the text. This section includes origin narratives, historical anecdotes, familial anecdotes, and detailed images and measurements of the instrument. The Taigensho demonstrates that the shakuhachi continued to have a place within court music even though it was no longer regularly played in the ensemble. Through both textual and visual evidence, the treaty provides information on how one of the preeminent court music families understood how the instrument fit within the modes and modality of court music, making the Taigensho one of the most valuable surviving sources for understanding the history of the instrument outside the Zen paradigm that now dominates the discussion. Now, this is really deep stuff, so I want to get a second opinion, and I reached out to my friend Fabio Rambelli, who is an expert on Japanese and Japanese religion, and plays the sho himself. Here's what he had to say. Quote, "Indeed, Muneaki's devotion to Nichiren and his proximity to the Hokke sect, aka Nichiren Buddhism, is quite idiosyncratic. However, it is well known that by the late 15th century, many members of the professional classes in Kyoto were affiliated with Hokke organizations, Machishu. It is not clear how and why Muneaki chose the Hokke sect, but it has been suggested that he may have been inspired by some of his companions of poetry creations, such as the Renga master Socho and Hokke priest Nichiyo, whom he frequently met at Sanjonishi Sanetaka's residence. In the late 15th century, Kyoto, after ravages of civil war, court life was much diminished, including musical activities, and there seems to have been more fluidity in social relations among people of various classes. In this sense, Muneaki's religious choice can also be seen as the aspect of his social fluidity. Besides, the Hokke sect at that time was not radically separate from the Tendai establishment and its teachings. Above all, in the late Muromachi period, there was no formal and continuous family affiliation with a specific temple or sect." Close quote. Now, on to our focus for today, the Shakuhachi section. The Shakuhachi section of Taigensho is one of the most significant surviving medieval documents concerning the early history of the shakuhachi in Japan. Located at the end of the 5th chapter of the 13-chapter treaty, the passage presents a rare glimpse into how the instrument was understood within the world of late medieval court culture. Far from being an isolated curiosity, the shakuhachi passage reveals the instrument's connections to gagaku, court ritual, and the Toyohara house. Modern scholarship has often treated the Edo period komusu tradition as the significant part of shakuhachi history, yet Taigensho complicates this narrative by presenting evidence of an already developed courtly shakuhachi tradition that goes back for centuries. The shakuhachi passage appears after discussions of other wind instruments, especially the sho, the primary instrument of the Toyohara lineage. This placement is important. the shakuhachi is not presented as a marginal folk instrument or an eccentric object outside elite musical culture. Instead, it appears within a structured discussion of court wind instruments, suggesting that Muneaki understood it as a part of the aristocratic musical system. The fact that the shakuhachi closes the chapter may also imply a special significance, acting as a culmination of discussion of wind instruments within the treaty before Muneaki starts discussing percussion instruments. According to Laron Harrison, who is currently reading through and translating the Taigensho, the majority of the shakuhachi section can be divided into 4 major parts. First, concerns the continental origins of the instrument, tracing the shakuhachi back to China. This reflects a common tendency in medieval Japanese scholarship to legitimize cultural practices through continental lineage. Court music itself came from the Chinese and Korean courts, and Muneaki situates the shakuhachi in that movement from the continent while pointing out where the events in the legend might have actually occurred. The shakuhachi is therefore not framed as rustic or purely a Japanese object, but as part of a larger Sinitic culture that shaped medieval court aesthetics. The Shakuhachi, Section 1, Translation and Notes. In a certain text, it says, quote, "As for the shakuhachi, the story about the cries of a monkey in the western provinces catching people's attention has become part of the written record." In the notes on Wa, it states the following about this matter. In the Tang Dynasty, the cries of the monkey dwelling in the mountains of the western provinces was unusual. All who heard its cries came to tears. People were struck with the will to follow the Buddhist teaching. Princes left behind their palaces. Various lords gave up their courtly titles and confined themselves in mountain temples. And hundreds of people, be they priest, merchant, or other, when they heard the cries, realized the principle of impermanence. The rulers of the time, with matters like these occurring, could not allow this to continue and issued orders to their warriors that this monkey was to be killed. It was extremely pitiful, and when the warriors heard of the death cries of this monkey, several tens of them took the tonsure, feeling sorrow for the blessings of knowledge of true goodness, and went off to a place to hide away and shed their tears. Among them, there was one who was truly saddened, and even after months and years had passed, the sadness had not. He dug up the dirt where the monkey was buried, and when we looked in to see what had become of the bones of the creature, he saw one arm bone. The inside of the bone had become hollow, and when the wind hit the bone, the sound he heard resembled the cry of the monkey. The feeling of pathos came back to him, and he took up the bone and returned home. When he remembered those events, he put the bone to his lips, and upon blowing it, made the sound of the monkey's cry. Also, there was a man who knew sound and pitches. He cut a bamboo stalk of that size, matched it to the size of the bone, but when he blew on it, it didn't sound and resemble it. He drilled one hole into the bamboo, and it only slightly started to resemble the sound. Next, he drilled another hole in it, and it gradually resembled the sound. Eventually, he opened up 4 holes on the front and 1 on the back. In its entirety, the bone was 1 shaku, 8 sun. Following this, it was abbreviated as shakuhachi and became the name. When one wonders where the place this monkey was crying out, the lines "In the Baixia Gorge, autumn deepens, the sorrows of 5 evenings, the monkey cries out towards the moon," come to mind and could likely refer to the area around Baixia. Also, one might recall the lines, "The borders of Chu, late in spring, hearing less and less, the solo monkey this evening, I give into shedding tears on my robe." It also might be this place. Notes. Muneaki is not trying to validate the facts of the monkey story. He simply lays out the textual sources and leaves it to the reader to decide. By linking the shakuhachi to the cries of the sorrowful monkey that inspired renunciation, impermanence, and Buddhist awakening, the instrument was framed as a vehicle for spiritual transformation. The references to Tang poetry and the western regions of China further rooted the shakuhachi within the prestige of Chinese literary and Buddhist culture, giving it cultural weight and legitimacy through association with refined civilization, poetic melancholy, and Buddhist compassion. For modern performers and researchers, the importance of the story lies less in whether it is historically factual and more in what it reveals about how pre-modern people understood sound itself. The shakuhachi was imagined as emerging from grief, memory, impermanence, and the imitation of nature rather than from technical invention alone. The shakuhachi, Section 2, Translation and Notes. The second section contains hagiographic or miraculous anecdotes. These stories depict the shakuhachi functioning in extraordinary circumstances. Such narratives are not intended to be entertaining folklore. They serve to establish the spiritual and aesthetic power of the instrument. In medieval Japanese thought, music was frequently understood to possess transformative or cosmological potency. Sound could influence emotions, harmonize social relations, and even affect the natural world. These miraculous anecdotes place the shakuhachi within this broader worldview, suggesting that its sound possessed an efficacy extending beyond ordinary entertainment. It reads as follows. It is said long ago, Shotoku Taishi traveled to Mount Ikoma, and with a shakuhachi pacified Somakusha. Amongst the treasures of Horyuji, there is a shakuhachi that is the very flute, and is said to be from ancient times. Also, on Omine, where mountain gods appear and dance, there is a place called Somukusha Peak, and it still exists to this day. And there are other stories like these. Jigaku Daishi on the Tendai mountain, during the time when his voice was not sufficient, took up a shakuhachi and intoned the Amida Sutra and made it sound out. Is established such as this in virtue and ethereal adornment. When he intoned at the twin doors at the southwest corner from the Jokyo Hall, there was a sound in the heavens that spoke, saying, add a ya. When you say, from this, thus, jishi nyozeya, add the ya. Notes. Shotoku Taishi has a very special place in the mytho-history of pre-Nara period Japan. He is depicted both as an austere ruler who helps bring Buddhism to Japan, and a man with connections to the spiritual world. He is first connected to the Bugaku piece Shomakusha, which depicts this story, but using a ryuteki instead of a shakuhachi. And then, the shakuhachi in that very encounter is preserved in Horyuji, the temple that he built in the 7th century. Jigaku Daishi is the posthumous name for Ennin, the second abbot of Enrakuji. In his second story of the shakuhachi, is not used as a musical instrument per se, but as a means of helping Ennin chant the Amida Sutra. In using the shakuhachi to chant the sutra, Ennin gets the beings in the heavens to respond and correct his intoning. While the two stories take place in different times, they both illustrate the shakuhachi is capable of moving the spirits and elicit their reactions. The shakuhachi, Section 3, Translation and Notes. The third section consists of historical anecdotes, grounding the shakuhachi within actual courtly events and performances. Here the instrument is understood as functioning part of ceremonial life. These passages are particularly valuable because they connect the shakuhachi directly to specific ritual and social contexts. LaRon Harrison emphasizes that this material demonstrates the instrument's integration into court banquets and court life. This evidence is crucial because it challenges later assumptions that shakuhachi history primarily belongs to wandering komoso of the Sengoku and the komuso of the Edo periods and their particular mythological lineage. Instead, the instrument already occupied a meaningful role within elite ceremonial culture during the Muromachi period and earlier. It reads as follows. Prince Sadayasu played this instrument. The piece called Wang Shao Jun had ceased to be performed, but he transferred the piece from the shakuhachi to the ryuteki. The world at large said that it was the sad tone of the piece that led to its disappearance, but there is absolutely no truth to that. In the testament of tonsured chancellor, it said, there are two types of shakuhachi. The long one is similar to a kagura flute. The short one has a sound similar to the hichiriki. Playing music with the shakuhachi was something done in the past. In recent times, it isn't done. But on the 23rd day of the first month of the third year of Hogen, 1158, the son of the captain of the left guard, Kyohara no Suketani, received the command and using the old scores, played the shakuhachi in the palace. It was a rare event. It says in a work called The Present Mirror that the shakuhachi was played in the palace on the 20th day of the first month of the third year of Hogen. Retired Emperor Go Shirakawa was in attendance. Notes. The Prince Sadayasu's story happens most likely during the reformation of the court music in the second half of the 9th century, when the shakuhachi fell out of performance favor. The shakuhachi was dropped from musical performances because the court musicians alone had to do all of the performing, and the Nara period model of playing the various regional musics of the continent became untenable. Sadayasu himself wrote a score of music for the ryuteki, and most likely this transfer of the piece from shakuhachi to ryuteki is part of his musical work. The second story is more straightforward. It starts by describing two types of shakuhachi and their tones, giving us a sense of how Heian nobles heard the instruments, and then depicts a moment in the late Heian period when the shakuhachi is performed. The performance is mentioned in the present mirror, a record that chronicles the events at court in the late Heian period, which adds validity to its actual occurrence, although the date it happened is disputed. The Shakuhachi, Section 4, Translation and Notes. The fourth section contains familial anecdotes centered on members of the Toyohara lineage. These stories are especially important because they place the shakuhachi within hereditary systems of musical transmission. Rather than presenting the instrument as disconnected from established musical institutions, Muneaki situates it within the lived practice of his own family. Since the Toyohara were hereditary shoal players and court musicians, these anecdotes strongly imply that shakuhachi performances existed alongside other forms of gagaku practice within aristocratic circles, though there is no evidence to support as of now that it was inside the courtly ensemble. However, it is important to note that gagaku just refers to the musical genre, not the ensemble as is often confused today. A shoal player and a ryuteki player together is gagaku. A solo shakuhachi player playing at a banquet is gagaku. It just may not be some of the subgenres like kagura, saibara, and so on. It reads as follows. In this house, there are illustrations on the playing of the shakuhachi. In this house, the late Kazuaki was said to be skilled at the shakuhachi. He went down to the rehearsal for Iwashimizu Festival, and some kids who were at the rehearsal went past him, and he followed after them. At the banquets, after the rehearsal, he blew his shakuhachi, and a deer drew near. The kids then said, "His playing will surely draw a huge swarm of bugs." This is something we have no doubts about. Atsuaki, from a different branch, was a student of Kazuaki. The person known as the Dengaku performer, Zoami, was also a student of Kazuaki. After Kazuaki's sudden passing, he learned from Atsuaki and finalized our illustrations in collaboration with Atsuaki. In this age, the shakuhachi players used this illustration. After this, Tonami played the shakuhachi. In reality, the man called Bun-a was someone who was skilled at being in tune. He was self-taught, and everything he has was gained by his pursuit of the path of music. He got close to me, and through that connection, I passed all of my knowledge of old matters to him. His learning those matters from morning to evening was truly moving things. Boring inside the holes was passed down to me, along with some rare matters. It is also said that until the reign of the retired emperor Go Horikawa, people played music on the shakuhachi, but we don't know who these players were. More notes. Among these familial stories, the anecdote concerning Toyohara Kazuaki, receives particular attention in the Taigensho because it fundamentally alters how the passage has previously been understood by other scholars. Earlier scholarship, especially that of Gunmar Jinmei Linder, interpreted this anecdote in a mystical or spiritualized manner. However, this interpretation resulted from mistranslation of several key terms. Correcting these terms transforms the story from a quasi-miraculous account into a highly practical description of court ceremonial activities. The first misunderstood term is hojoe, which refers specifically to the Iwashimizu Hachimangu festival, one of the major ritual events associated with the imperial court. This was not a vague spiritual gathering, but the central ceremonial occasion tied to the shrine. The second term, shigaku, refers to the rehearsal, specifically the dress rehearsal of the court music and dance performances for the ceremony. The third, kudaru, meaning to descend from the capital, referring to travel from Kyoto to the shrine located outside the city. Together, these corrections radically change the meaning of this anecdote. In the revised interpretation, Kazuaki travels from the capital to attend the rehearsal from Iwashimizu Festival. Rather than participating in mystical wanderings, he spends time with children near the rehearsal grounds. That Kazuaki is hanging out with the children and not part of the dress rehearsal indicates that his services are not needed for the rehearsal or the actual ceremony. The narrative then reveals that his musical talents were needed in the banquets held after the rehearsal. During his performances of Shakuhachi, a deer approaches, leading the children to comment on the effectiveness of his playing. The kids see Kazuaki's ability as potential means for catching insects. The important point is that this story is embedded within an ordinary ceremonial framework. Kazuaki is acting as a court musician, fulfilling a role within a major religious and social event. This reinterpretation has broad implications for Shakuhachi history. The anecdote demonstrates that the instrument functioned within court ritual structures and banquet culture during the 15th century. The shakuhachi was therefore part of a practice in the philosophical sense, a socially organized system of repeated, goal-oriented actions governed by norms, roles, and expectations. Court ritual required musical performance to properly honor deities, entertain participants, and maintain cosmic and social harmony. The shakuhachi's role within these ceremonies revealed it as an integrated into institutionalized cultural practices rather than existing outside elite society. The Iwashimizu Hachimangu festival involved ritually welcoming the deity Hachiman from heaven, entertaining the deity through offerings and performances, and ensuring divine blessings upon the realm. Musical performances was therefore not incidental, but essential to the success of the ritual. By playing shakuhachi during associated banquets, Kazuaki participated in the larger ceremonial process, through which the court sought to maintain divine favor and political stability. The shakuhachi, Section 5, the visual aspects. Equally important are the visual materials included in the shakuhachi section. The Taigensho contains 9 distinct shakuhachi images, including diagrams connected to tonal relationships and modal systems. These images have often been neglected in favor of textual analysis, yet they may be among the most revealing parts of the passage. The diagrams suggest surprising continuities between medieval construction and modern instruments. Measurements, hole placements, and pitch relationships appear to correspond closely with the later hitoyogiri and earlier shakuhachi Edo variations. This is potentially revolutionary for shakuhachi scholarship because it challenges the assumptions that modern shakuhachi practice emerged primarily during the Edo period through the Komuso tradition. Instead, the diagrams in Taigensho imply that certain structures and acoustical principles of the instrument were already established in the Muromachi period within the court culture. The instrument's modal relationships and tonal organizations may therefore possess a much longer and more continuous history than previously acknowledged. The passage just after the image reads as follows: "The above illustrations are annotated like this. In recent days, Regarding the matter of dengaku performers saying shakuhachi is in keeping with their path, there is absolutely no details to support this claim. The man called Zoami became a student of Kazuaki and played because of that. After Kazuaki's sudden passing, he got closer with Kazuaki's student Atsuaki. Later, at Washino, the spiritual mountain of Hagashiyama, they edited the illustrations. However, the works of the modes, Atsuaki put all that down. Notes. Muneaki, both before and after the image, provides an explanation of how the images came about. Kazuaki's sudden death leaves his two students, Atsuaki and Zoami, to create the images to preserve their teacher's knowledge of the instrument. Zoami was a dengaku performer who, according to the sarugaku actor playwright Zeami, performed a play called Shakuhachi, which saw him playing the instrument before he departed the stage. The play, unfortunately, has been lost, but surely must have been an impetus for Zoami to study under Kazuaki. The images also serve as a second purpose, to demonstrate a legitimate claim to knowledge of the instrument. As Muneaki notes, dengaku performers, after Zoami gained the attention of the fourth shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimochi, were doing all that they could to follow suit and gain similar high-status patrons. One of their tactics was to claim things belonged to them retroactively and create made-up stories to support their claims. Muneaki debunks those claims by relating how the images came about and that Atsuaki did all the work on the modal images. The Shakuhachi, Section 6, in closing. Okay, so why is all of this important? The Shakuhachi section of Taigensho forces a reconsideration of early Shakuhachi history. Rather than beginning primarily as a, quote, Zen instrument of wandering mendicants, the shakuhachi appears here as an instrument embedded in aristocratic ritual, hereditary musical transmission, and court ceremonial practice. The passage reveals a medieval world in which music, religion, politics, literature, and social hierarchy were inseparable. Through its combination of historical anecdotes, ritual context, family lineage, and technical diagrams, Taigensho preserves one of the richest surviving portraits of the shakuhachi before the rise of the Edo period komusou tradition. Let's wrap it up. Toyohara no Muneaki stood at the crossroads of a collapsing medieval order and the emergence of a new Japan. Living through the destruction of Kyoto and weakening the court authority and the rise of regional military powers, he nevertheless devoted his life to preserving one of the oldest artistic traditions in Japanese history. Through the Taigensho, Muneaki did far more than write a musical manual. He created a cultural archive, one that preserves not only technical information about gagaku and the shakuhachi, but also reveals the intricate web connecting music, poetry, ritual, religion, aristocratic lineage, and social transformation in late medieval Japan. What we get from the Taigensho is a vision of music fundamentally different from modern assumptions. Music was not only entertainment. It was also not isolated from the broader intellectual and religious worlds. It functions as ritual technology, social practice, political symbolism, aesthetic cultivation, and hereditary knowledge all at once. Court musicians such as Muneaki were not simply performers, they were custodians of cultural memory during an age when the institutions supporting that memory were collapsing around them. The shakuhachi section, in particular, forces a major reconsideration of the instrument's history. Rather than appearing first and foremost as the instrument of wandering mendicants, the Taigensho reveals a shakuhachi already embedded within courtly and ceremonial life centuries earlier. The instrument appears connected to banquet culture, hereditary musical transmission, religious, ritual, and modal systems tied directly to gagaku practice. Muneaki's text therefore complicates the simplified narrative that has long dominated shakuhachi history and opens possibilities of a far deeper and more continuous lineage between medieval court culture and later shakuhachi traditions. At the same time, the Taigensho also reflects the remarkable fluidity of the late Muromachi world itself. Muneaki moved within circles that included emperors, court nobles, poets, monks, musicians, and religious figures. his studies under Sanjonishi Sanetaka, his friendship with figures such as Socho, and his apparent devotion to Nichiren Buddhism demonstrates how artistic, literary, and religious communities increasingly overlap during this fractured age. In many ways, Muneaki embodies the contradictions of medieval Japan: aristocratic, yet adaptive, conservative, yet innovative, deeply rooted in tradition while responding to a rapidly changing world. The Taigensho survives as more than a historical curiosity. It is a witness to cultural resilience in an era marked by war, famine, political collapse, and uncertainty. Through his efforts, Muneaki brought together fragments of an older world that endured long enough to influence the artistic traditions that followed. For scholars of Japanese music, religion, literature, and Shakuhachi history alike, the Taigensho remains one of the most valuable windows into the intellectual and musical life of late medieval Japan. Outro. Thank you for joining me on this fourth installment of Unmasked. And a super special thank you to Dr. Laron Harrison for his expertise and guidance in the making of this episode. In the next episode, we will continue peeling back the layers of Shakuhachi history and examining the sources, myths, people, and institutions that shaped the instrument long before the modern narrative surrounding it took hold. The deeper we look into these medieval materials, the clearer it becomes that the history of the shakuhachi is far more complex, interconnected, and fascinating than the simple stories often repeated today. Behind every instrument, lineage, and tradition lies an entire world of politics, religion, ritual, and human relationships waiting to be rediscovered. Until next time, roll for 10.